In the late 90s and the start of the new century, Squaresoft found itself sitting on top of the world. Their move from Nintendo to PlayStation worked out remarkably well for them, with Final Fantasy VII and VIII selling record numbers and being highly praised by critics across the board. While not as financially successful internationally, Final Fantasy IX had been wildly successful in Japan. For 2 decades, Square had specialized in making sprawling RPGs, but as early as 1996, the winds of change were starting to blow over the industry. The smash success of Super Mario 64 had caused the designers at Square to think about how they could throw their hat into the wild frontier of 3D platformers. While casually talking in the office, some of the designers in the company had joked about how they didn't have a character who would be able to move sails the same way Mario would. In fact, the only character they could think of who'd be able to stand up to Nintendo's plumber was the Big Mouse himself, Mickey Mouse. This was, of course, only a joke. But then that joke somehow became a reality when Square happened to be sharing an office building with Disney of Japan. And after a chance meeting between executives in an elevator, a deal was struck between the two companies. This couldn't have happened at a better time for Square, because while they were joking about getting into the 3D platformer space, they were unfortunately not joking about getting into the movie business. This lack of joking led to the disastrous release of Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, a movie that bombed so absurdly hard that it almost sank the entire company. The creative lead behind Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi, was essentially thrown under the bus and made his exit, and Enix was starting to reconsider a merger that was in progress between the two companies. The only thing that saved that merger, and the company in general, was the runaway success of 2 releases, Final Fantasy X, and the fruition of that elevator ride with Disney, Kingdom Hearts, a bizarre anime action game crossing Final Fantasy with the House of Mouse's biggest animated brands. From there, Kingdom Hearts blossomed into one of Square's most successful IPs, seeing releases on the PlayStation 2, the GBA, PSP, DS, and 3DS. Strangely enough, despite being remastered to hell and back, the series had largely avoided the Switch outside of a spin-off rhythm game. This was odd, as theoretically these games could definitely run on the handheld console hybrid. But now, finally, after all this time hoping for a game series that would fit perfectly on Switch, Kingdom Hearts has arrived on Nintendo's flagship platform. And it's a train wreck. Okay, before we get started, I want to explain to you how my testing of these titles worked. For each game, I tried my best to do the initial tests in a different environment, featuring an assortment of variables. These environments include on regular Wi-Fi, on heavily used Wi-Fi, wired Ethernet, outside family Wi-Fi, and public Wi-Fi. These variables are meant to test these games on every possible setting you may encounter in your day-to-day life. However, any footage you see in this video will be taken on Wi-Fi in relatively normal conditions, just due to the limitations of my recording setup. I should also note that I did not finish any of these games for this video. In fact, I did not even come close for a majority of them. I've already played every single one of them, and I know their general quality. If you're here to learn about how one of these titles is as a game, there are a wealth of places you can go to find that information. Some of these games are nearing 20 years old. This piece is more about what it's like to play the Kingdom Hearts games on a platform that has historically had issues with releases of this type. With that being said, we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. To begin our journey through the experience of playing Kingdom Hearts on the cloud, we begin on a small island with our main characters and also Kairi in 2002's Kingdom Hearts. Originally released for the PlayStation 2, it was Square's first foray into a 3D platformer. I know you might be yelling to me that Kingdom Hearts is not a platformer, and I really wish that early 2000s Squaresoft agreed with you. Despite having launched one of the most popular action RPGs in video games, it's hard not to say that in general, the game shows its age quite a bit. Sora's movements feel a bit stiff at times, the level design is insanely uncommunicative, etc. I don't want to talk about my feelings on this game too much because I have already done so at length in multiple other places, including 2 playthroughs on Twitch and a podcast episode all about it. You can find links to those in the description down below. So what is it like to play this game through the magic of the cloud? For this test, I just used the default docked-on Wi-Fi setup most people will probably use. The instant the game gave me free reign on the island, I immediately made my way to Riku. If I could beat Riku, surely that was a sign this wasn't as bad as I feared. And I did beat Riku, pretty handily at that. But the entire fight, I found myself wondering how I was beating him, because multiple times I would be locked onto him and tell Sora to swing his sword, and by the time Sora got the message and swung, Riku had already moved an inch or two to the side, meaning Sora missed a strike. Nevertheless, I did defeat Riku, and the score became 1-0. The next major test was the race to name the raft. I lost the race to name the raft harder than I have ever lost anything in any game I have ever played. What had until this point been largely a minor annoyance suddenly made me unable to walk in a straight line as the inputs from both analog sticks began sticking for longer than they were supposed to, so the camera would wildly swing from side to side as I desperately tried to correct my direction. Jumps were a joke, unable to be input with any accuracy. Eventually, I just gave up. The raft was being named the Highwind, and I was just going to have to live with that. For the most part, the experience stayed roughly the same as I moved on to Traverse Town, though when Donald and Goofy joined the party, there was a slight but noticeable rise in the input lag. The other half of problems appeared upon my entering Wonderland. While the disastrous race with Riku had already shown that platforming was going to potentially be a problem, I just chalked that up to the fact that I was under pressure and rushing through it. There isn't a lot of platforming to be found in Wonderland, and none of it is high stakes. It's literally just getting up to stuff to open chests. This became way more of a challenge than usual when there was even the slightest delay between my inputs and Sora's movements. This did not paint a great picture. If I was struggling with the barely present platforming of Wonderland, how on earth was I going to fare against the worlds that are completely structured around it, such as Monstro, or Halloween Town, or even Agrabah? Would the input lag on Hollow Bastion cause me to fall back down into the starting area more than usual? The results of this experiment were not encouraging so far. I will say that while platforming was always a pain, the problems didn't seem to impact actual combat all that much, at least not as often. Don't get me wrong, it still wasn't nearly as fluid as it would be on actual hardware. I had more trouble with the guard armor fight than I ever have before, but then on the Trickster boss, one I have traditionally had difficulty with in the past, I had an easier time than usual. This somehow paints both an optimistic and a worrying feeling about delving into Kingdom Hearts 2, a game that removed much of the platforming and refined the combat. I'm not entirely sure how that's going to go, but it's going to be a second before we find out. We're going in the HD release order, so we have a deck of cards to assemble first. Kingdom Hearts Rechain of Memories is a full 3D remake of the game Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories, originally released in 2004 for the Game Boy Advance. Both are fairly divisive titles among the fan base, with arguments regularly flaring up around which one's better and if one or both of them are just bad. The story takes place between Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, seeing Sora, Donald, and Goofy walking into the mysterious Castle Oblivion. Here their memories begin to be tampered with by a girl named Naminé, while a group of villains in black coats, who seem to be pulling the strings from the outside, work their various schemes. I don't have a lot of fondness for Rechain's combat as it is, which replaces the combo-based systems of the first game with a deck-building game that turns all of your abilities into cards. It is by far my least favorite game in this collection, and for that reason, I knew it would be the one I spent the least amount of time with. So it was time to add in one of those other variables. What happens if somebody else is doing something resource-intensive on the Wi-Fi? I loaded up a HoloLive YouTube stream to play in the background, and started the game. The results of this experiment were less than promising right out of the gate. Cutscenes lagged so much more than they had during my time with the first game, audio consistently cut out and skipped, with music trying to speed up to catch up to where it was supposed to be. At one point, Donald asked, "Where are you going, Sora?" To which Sora responded, "That way, to the door." Except the cutscene audio skipped halfway through Sora's line, so his inner caveman activated and he simply shouted, "That way, to door!" It only got worse from there. As I began to actually play the game, lag spikes were constant, both in and out of battle. Outside of battle, the spikes worked rather similarly to some of the problems I had with the first game's delay, most notably inputs for the camera getting stuck and swinging wildly past where I wanted it. Don't you worry though, because Rechain on Cloud wanted to make sure I knew that this one would be painful to play in new and exciting ways. As I got into more and more fights, I began to feel like I was running out of cards much quicker than usual. And that's because I was. I would hit the button to use a card, a lag spike would occur, and suddenly I have now used 3 cards. Rinse and repeat a few times, and suddenly it was already time to reload the deck. This also made the card break mechanic extremely difficult, as being able to react to an opponent's card quickly becomes a Herculean task when there is about a half second between your button press and the actual input being registered. Of all the games in this collection, Rechain likely suffers the most in terms of minute-to-minute gameplay. Kingdom Hearts 2 is often considered one of the most improved upon sequels of all time, refining the formula into the straight action game we know the series for today. Platforming? Mostly gone. Combat? Far more fluid. Story? Organization 13 is a fantastic group of antagonists, and also the story feels a lot more competently told. As much as this series can be, at least. Roxas, the character you control throughout the prologue, is actually quite interesting in terms of his short character arc. Xemnas has the greatest voice in the history of video games. Basically, I'm saying that Kingdom Hearts 2 is a fantastic video game through and through. That's the main reason why this one is likely going to be the most painful for me. Kingdom Hearts 2 is my favorite game of all time. I have played through it more times than I have played through anything else in my life. So I guess it was time to just rip the band-aid off and see the damage firsthand. As this is my favorite, it's the one that has the honor of being tested on a wired connection, and maybe that would make some difference in the end. And I really did hope that. I really hoped that with all my heart. But no, it didn't. The warning signs were there from minute 1, even as the opening cutscene's frame rate chugged and the audio cut out constantly. I need to be clear that I have Google Fiber, and the good stuff too. I pay good money for a stable internet connection. My internet is up there with the best possible setup you can get in most areas of the US. When it can't even run the cutscenes when hooked up to a wired connection, every hope I had has been completely tanked. Anyways, how did it play? Well, later in the Twilight Town prologue, you have a fight with Cypher from Final Fantasy VIII. It's a super easy combat tutorial, and he hit me not once, not twice, but 4 times. I have never been hit during that fight. Ever. By this point, the light had left my eyes and I'd stopped being even partially optimistic about how this was going to go. I played the entire prologue on a wired connection, and the quality was nearly indistinguishable from the test on regular Wi-Fi. I actually cannot believe that this was the case. More difficulties appeared during the section where you are playing mini-games to earn beach trip money. My usual go-to game for this section is mail delivery. It's one that I can do incredibly fast and easy. Normally, I finish around 8 to 9 seconds, but on the cloud, it took me upwards of 25 seconds, because the input delay would mean I couldn't do the input in time. Even when I tried to compensate for the input delay, it still didn't work, as it's impossible to compensate for something that is seemingly changing every second. There was also a moment where I thought I had missed one of the deliveries, but as I was going back to hit the prompt, I realized I had made the delivery. The game had just cut out at the perfect time for me to not hear the sound effect or see the animation. I was able to hit 10 seconds after several tries, but when I continued after, it turned out that one was a fluke. And this is all assuming your inputs actually go through, which sometimes they just don't. You hit the button to deliver the mail to a bird, and then nothing will happen as you feel every atom making up your body, crying out in pain and begging to be freed from this mortal coil. What I'm saying is, even on a really good wired connection, these games don't work. I'm just depressed at this point, but whatever. Let's move on. Originally released for the PSP, Birth by Sleep serves as a prequel to the series and is split into 3 main campaigns following Aqua, Terra, and Ventus, 3 Keyblade wielders training under anime Luke Skywalker. When creatures called the Unversed begin to threaten the worlds, a plot begins to unravel the personal relationships between these 3 great friends, and a sinister player begins pulling the strings of a game that will have a ripple effect far into the future. Anyways, speaking of unraveling personal relationships, I did initial tests on this game by going over to a family member's house and playing on their Wi-Fi, because I figured this would be closer to a normal connection experience than me playing at home. After skipping through the millions of hours of cutscenes that make up the beginning of Birth by Sleep, the game ran about as well as I expected. Not especially worse than the initial tests on my home Wi-Fi. In fact, the input lag felt a little better than before, and the game felt a tad more playable than previous tests, though still not perfect. Visual quality dropped a few times during large fights, and audio continued to cut in and out during cutscenes. There really isn't much more to say here other than I figured it would be far worse than it ended up being. Essentially, I'm pleasantly surprised, but still not overly impressed. I know what you're thinking. Joe, these are just cutscene compilations. Do you really need to talk about them in your video about the cloud versions? You'd think that would be an easy question to answer. How do you screw up what is essentially just a movie? Well, there are actually a couple of ways that these specific parts highlight some of these ports' faults better than the other sections. The most pressing issue being that after 5 minutes of what the game and system see as inactivity, the screen will dim and a message will appear telling you that you shall soon be booted out of the session. 2 minutes later, it will do just that, throwing you out of the game and back to the wallpaper that displays before you access it. This isn't a huge problem elsewhere in the collection, as the act of playing a game means you're constantly providing input. Except here, you're just watching a movie. Input is not a factor you have to worry about because you are literally just watching a movie. Having to regularly jiggle the analog stick every few minutes to avoid being kicked out of your remote movie watching session is a pain, and this alone means that you would honestly probably have a better experience just looking up a compilation on YouTube. There are pockets of reading a plot summary whenever a cutscene wasn't there to be put into this movie, so I guess it's not like these are devoid of any input requirement. It's a good thing none of these are an hour-long continuous animated film. That brings us straight into the 2.8 collection, which happens to feature an hour-long animated film starring characters from the mobile game Kingdom Hearts Chi, without any of the occasional inputs or reading that the compilations of 358/2 or Recoded have. I was especially worried about this for that reason, and since I was expecting the worst, I hit play and set my controller down, waiting for the server to kick me for idling. And it never did. At least, when idle for about half an hour, the screen might have dimmed, which is the fault of the Switch and for once not the cloud games, but I never even got the warning that I would be booted for idling. The movie still had stuttering and frame rate issues, but my assumption of the worst this time actually ended up not being the case. So, there you go. One win. You can watch the movie with a bad frame rate largely without interruption. Anyways, originally released for the 3DS, you can tell because they bent over backwards to make the title abbreviate to 3Ds, Dream Drop Distance puts you in control of both Sora and Riku using one of the most annoying mechanics the series has ever seen. They are traveling through the Sleeping Worlds, worlds that simply fell into hibernation to avoid being destroyed by the Heartless as part of their Mark of Mastery exam to decide whether or not they are worthy of the title of Keyblade Master. It is also the most financially successful game Naku Sakuraba has ever appeared in. Dream Drop is known for being the series' true jump the shark moment, with its ending directly setting up Kingdom Hearts 3, and therefore one of the most convoluted moments to be seen in the mainline games. So this seemed like a great one to give my final and stupidest variable a try. I got in my car, drove to a coffee shop. I'm driving way too much for this video. Ordered a coffee, got on the Wi-Fi, and played some Kingdom Hearts. I mean, come on. This is the Switch, right? The biggest selling point is the ability to play all of its games on the go. Sat down in a Starbucks, connected my Switch to the Wi-Fi, booted up the game, expecting an absolute disaster to unfold. And then it didn't. It was actually weirdly stable the whole time. Input latency was still a bit of a problem, but cutscene audio did not skip nearly as much, and during fights, the gameplay felt relatively smooth. I'm almost upset at how well it ran, in a way. I'm not sure if it's because the time slot I played during was a time when the servers weren't as busy, or if Starbucks Wi-Fi is really that beefy, but apparently the pro strat is to just go play these cloud games specifically on a Starbucks Wi-Fi. Be ready to buy a lot of coffee. There's also a heavy possibility that when I conducted the test a Sunday afternoon, the servers just weren't as congested at that time. I'm more willing to believe the second one, but more testing in this environment may be required in the future. This game gives a canon reason why Mickey Mouse isn't wearing a shirt during his appearance in the original game. That's all I have to say about it. Pretty much any issue with that is the same as the final game on the docket, so we're just gonna skip straight to that. This is the main event, the long-awaited third entry in the Kingdom Hearts series that took almost 20 years to come out, and the only game on this list that is actually justified in being a cloud version. Originally released for the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, this game would cause a Switch to melt after about 15 minutes of play. The game puts you in control of Sora once again as he journeys through the worlds in the hopes of building a team to take part in the upcoming Keyblade War. As this is the main event of the video, and seemingly the one that has the most to lose visually from streaming, I decided not to test this game using one of my testing environments. I tested it with all 5. Let's start at the top with a wired connection, which at first seemed like it might be going well. The cutscene at the start of the game ran relatively well, but the instant the Face My Fears video began, the old familiar audio cutouts began to occur. During the tutorial battle, it seemed to run rather smoothly overall, but then the cutscene with Yen Sid introduced a brand new problem, when the audio and video in the scene desynced completely and never recovered. Again, this was on a wired connection, and during a pre-rendered cutscene, this did not paint an optimistic picture of what to expect. Yet, during battle, this was actually the best any of these games had run to this point. There was still the occasional hang, but overall it felt surprisingly smooth. After about an hour, I figured I'd had it too good for too long, and so I dropped the wired connection and headed into Phase 2 of testing. Phase 2 was the normal Wi-Fi phase, and outside of literally putting me into a queue to play this single-player game, there honestly wasn't all that much change to the quality of the stream. Visual quality had gone down slightly, but not to a massive degree, and it still ran relatively smooth compared to the rest of the games on this collection. There was still input latency, but funnily enough, 3's incredibly simplified combat made that not matter, and I'll let you decide whether or not you take that as a pro or a con, because to be honest, I still don't know how I am taking it. That is not to say that the game runs perfectly. There were still plenty of audio hiccups and frame drops, especially during scenes where Thebes was on fire. This meant that some of the worst of it happened during the Trinity Sled sections, which made the branching paths real fun. Overall, this was still a relatively successful test, which means it was time to actively make it a worse experience. For science. So once again, I threw on a HoloLive stream, let it clam up the Wi-Fi for a bit, and then jumped right back in. This also happened around the same time the game had given me access to the attractions mechanic, specifically the pirate ship, and oh no. This is essentially how I had expected these to go. Flooding the screen with particle effects is usually a good way to tank visual quality, even on a good service. You see it all the time on places like YouTube and Twitch. Otherwise, as expected, general performance got demonstrably worse during this phase, and you can especially see it when trying to dodge the Rock Titan's boulders. As mentioned before, the fact that combat in 3 is simplified for the sake of being a more flashy spectacle makes input latency a little less of a problem, but this can work to its detriment as well. More spectacle means bigger groups of enemies, and bigger groups of enemies means more calculations and positions the game has to keep track of. This went about as well as one would expect, especially during Phase 3 of testing. The last 2 phases of testing were the handheld phases, both on Starbucks Wi-Fi and on family Wi-Fi. Starbucks actually came out of order, as I did that test at the same time I did the Dream Drop test. As it was in those same conditions, I experienced roughly the same thing. Game ran relatively well, cutscene audio wasn't cutting in and out as much, and the input lag was on the better end of the spectrum compared to other tests. Attractions like the pirate ship did cause the visual quality to completely tank, and it was even harder to look at on handheld as the whole screen became a blurry pixelated mess. Otherwise, it ran okay, so the strat still seems to just go to a Starbucks and play the whole series there. The time for the final test was at last upon us, so I packed up and headed back over to a family member's house to test it there.
No, seriously, gas is like $4 a gallon right now.
Once again, not as bad as I expected, though there were more moments of the game freezing for a full second during fights, which is not an ideal thing to happen while staring down a group of Neo Shadows and Dusks. Once again, I find myself pleasantly surprised, but still not impressed. At the end of the day, Kingdom Hearts 3 on the cloud is a bit of a weird experience, as a lot of things about the game's design lessen the problems that all these games suffer. It's not so much that the game was running better, just more that the simplification of combat means that input lag isn't nearly as much of an issue. If anything, the performance of this game in particular only serves to reinforce that it's the only one that is fully justified in being a cloud release in the end. It's depressing, honestly. This should not be how this all wound up. The general assumption about why these came out in the manner they did is because there would be no real way to keep the file size down on things like the 1.5 plus 2.5 compilation. And that makes sense to a degree. The PC release on the Epic Game Store puts the file size of just that collection at around 60 gigs, something that would be a massive inconvenience to most Switch owners and would not even begin to fit on a physical Switch cartridge. So then why not split them up? That's how Capcom did the Switch versions of the Devil May Cry games, 3 games that are also really only available elsewhere as a package deal. The running theory there is that they were worried people might not buy all of the games, and I'm gonna have to say that I disagree with that being the case. I may personally have my issues with some of these games, but all of them still have fans. People would have absolutely bought the original Kingdom Hearts, or Rechain, or 2, or Birth by Sleep, or Dream Drop Distance. Those games would have been fine on their own. Releasing in this state is such a letdown. Despite its flaws, this series is one I absolutely adore. Where else can I see Auron from Final Fantasy X fighting Disney's Hercules as Donald Duck shouts about the philosophical and literal conflict of light and darkness, and the implications of things that can exist between or outside that? The Switch is the perfect place for these games to shine, and while it would have made perfect sense if Kingdom Hearts 3 had to be relegated to a cloud release, the rest of these games were made for systems that predate and are much weaker than the Switch. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know how much work went into these or how much harder it would have been to separate them out into multiple releases. I think it would be arrogant to pretend I know better than the people actually working on them. What I can say is that, from the outside looking in, These releases feel as though Square Enix decision makers thought it would cost too much money to split them up and decided something was better than nothing. And I honestly don't think I can agree with that sentiment.